Hello and welcome to this session, Identity Meets Entitlements, the key to hybrid cloud security. In other words, we're going to tell you or talk about why securing identities is critical to cloud security going into 2025. My name is Nagraj Seshadri, the VP of Cloud Security Marketing at Tenable. Securing the cloud is uniquely challenging when compared to securing on-prem environments. We have new architectures, new design patterns that operate at scale. In this example, we can see we have hundreds of thousands of cloud resources and even millions of identity resources. Identity resources are critical because they provide access to lots of different resources, whether it's virtual machines, containers, data stores, and so on in the cloud. And this presents an attack surface that is very tempting for threats. And you have identities that are fairly sprawling across multi-clouds, hybrid, and on-prem environments. All of this presents new attack vectors which needs to be defended against. And of course, given the spread of environments, we have tooling overload. We may have certain security controls for on-prem which may not work in the cloud. And given the complexity and the newness of some of these environments, there's always a shortage of expertise in being able to understand what environments are like and how to secure them better. And given that we have different types of tools, collaboration becomes a challenge. For example, AWS describes its identity and access management concepts in a very interesting way. Lots of complexity, lots of connectivity, and so on. Now, if you look at Azure, similar but different. And if you look at Google Cloud, similar but different. Of course, an identity is an identity, but the way they're handled, the way they're treated, the way they're connected can be different in these different cloud environments. And these nuances are what attackers can exploit. So that's where we need to understand and try and get a handle on how to secure identities. If you look at the recent Microsoft State of Multi-Cloud Security Risk Report, they looked at about over 200 million identities. And these 200 million identities had about 51,000 permissions. And only 2% of these 50,000 permissions were actually used by the business applications. The remaining 98% were unused, or in other words, presented an attack surface to potential attackers and had no reason for use within the business. And of these 2% of permissions that were actually in use, 50% of these permissions were considered high risk. So here is a great example of how permissions and identities present a massive attack surface. Here's another risk report example, Tenable Cloud Security Outlook report, where we found that 99% of the organizations that suffered a cloud-related breach cited identities and permissions risk as the root cause. And here's an actual example of an attack on an AWS S3 data bucket, where it all started with a Log4 shell vulnerability in a payment software that then moved on and escalated to misconfigurations and mistakes in granting permissions to access AWS S3 buckets. And here are some more technical details that you could go into and read offline. And if you look at how the attack progressed, we have the mass scanning of the internet for vulnerable servers. So this is publicly accessible. The Log4j vulnerability was exploited. Access privileges were gained or granted, where you had the Amazon S3 full access permissions, and storage buckets were accessed and potentially deleted, or actually deleted, I think in this example, leading to loss of data and a data breach. And 2 million customer records with a lot of sensitive information was exposed. And the question is, how do we actually break this chain of activities? And one area where we found a major weak spot was access permissions or privileges. If we are able to control these access privileges, we can actually reduce the risk of a data breach, even when other things go wrong. And it goes on and on and on. We've had, again, here's a TechStong Pulse Meter survey which said that identity-related breaches and access permissions contributed to almost 47% of incidents. The CISA makes a recommendation that says that system and service accounts should implement the principle of least privilege, which is really providing tightly scoped access to resources required for the service to function and nothing else, or no more. Strictly on a need-to-know basis, in other words. So why is controlling identities and securing identities such a big issue in the cloud? Firstly, poor visibility. Lack of in-depth visibility into identities from users to service accounts to third parties and what they're accessing is the first challenge that needs to be overcome. Identity sprawl. We discussed how every cloud has a different way of handling identities, and we have a large number of identities that are operating in the cloud, and just too many things to manage manually. And of course, the complexity, as we said earlier, access is different in the cloud and different design patterns, and the problem gets magnified in a multi-cloud environment. And a key thing here is that security is always concerned about not disrupting the business. And access to critical business resources and applications are absolutely paramount. And nothing should get in the way of disrupting that. And as a result, security is really caught in a challenging situation where they lack the context and miss key information to figure out what are the risky hotspots in an environment. And of course, we have also the opposite problem of too many alerts, too many false positives. Trying to find the balance is extremely challenging, and context is a way to try and achieve that balance. And we'll get into it a little later. And then, of course, as we had said earlier, identities are pretty complex and challenging to understand and implement in the cloud, let alone secure in a multi-cloud environment. So the key to solving the identity challenge in your cloud, as we said earlier, is firstly, of course, to gain visibility into how these identities are being used and access is granted in the cloud, and then understanding the context in which these identities operate and the risks associated with these identities. Of course, we'll have vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, sensitive data at risk, but all of these should not be seen, all these risks should not be seen in isolation, but really looked in a cohesive, unified whole, where we use the context we gain from access and identities to understand what are the biggest risks in the cloud, not just to where my vulnerabilities are the most critical, but also which identities have excess access or too many privileges in terms of accessing sensitive data or compute instances within the environment. And now if you layer on the vulnerability risk, the misconfiguration risk, and the sensitive data risk to this context, you get a much better picture of where the biggest risks are and how to prioritize those risks. So then you move from an alert fatigue, information overload, to the top handful of potential risks that are associated with access and identity that can be quickly resolved to reduce and to help achieve a meaningful reduction in risk. And here is a quick summary in terms of what is a checklist of securing identities and to create a secure cloud environment. Firstly, is to review entitlements. So we need to review entitlements for every user and every resource in the cloud. And every user could be both a human user and a machine user. The second is to identify exposures with publicly, I'm going to redo the slide. So to summarize, securing identities is key to a secure cloud. Here are 6 things that we should be looking at and trying to achieve in our cloud security program. Firstly, review entitlements. Review entitlements for every user and every resource in your cloud. And a user could be both a human user and a machine user. The second is to identify exposures or potential exposures with publicly exposed resources that could be having misconfigured security groups or network access control lists, or having a combination of exploitable vulnerabilities. So these are all potential exposure points that need to be identified. The third is really determining who has access, and this is especially important when it comes to third-party identities and understanding what permissions third-party identities have access to at the individual resource level, whether it's a data storage bucket or a compute instance. The fourth, bottom left, is managing permissions. And this is especially important when you're determining what privileged identities are being used versus lying dormant or orphaned. So this is really critical because privileged identities, by definition, have a lot of deep access into the environment. And here you have the challenge of entitlement drift, where over time, these identities gain more and more access and permissions to the environment, but often they're not used, as we saw in the Microsoft report example earlier, where a majority of the permissions being granted were never used. So this presents an attack surface that needs to be managed through permissions control and reduction and trimming. The fifth is maintaining compliance. So really it comes down to reviewing and replacing all non-compliant policies with the least privilege alternative. And lastly, the goal of most security programs is to protect data and ensure that business applications are not disrupted. And here, the first thing is to inventory, classify, and track where secure data resides across the cloud environment and who has access to it. So by getting a handle on these 6 different areas, one can dramatically increase the security of the cloud and increase the security of cloud identities. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this session.